Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of Scope Rating, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Aviation Finance Outlook 2021. My name is Keith Mullin, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this session for you today. I'm delighted to be joined by Helene Spro, Director in Scope Ratings GmbH, who will take us through a short presentation in a couple of minutes in terms of what you should be being mindful of when it comes to aviation and valuations. And so before Helen starts, I did want to draw your attention to the fact that you can ask questions as and when the presentation is going on. So there is a questions box in the panel there. So please don't be shy, feel free to ask questions. And then once we've gone through the presentation, I'll actually run through the questions with Helen and try and answer them to the best of our ability. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen to start the presentation, and I will see you at the other end. Helen, welcome, great to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Keith. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As it's Friday afternoon, at least where I'm seated, I'll start with letting you know the agenda for today, so you all know when we can finally start our weekend. So here's the agenda, and I will go through the different points relatively quick. But if there's anything you want more detail on, you can find our complete outlook on our website, scoperatings.com. And as Keith also mentioned, feel free to ask any questions in the chat section, and we'll address them at the end of this presentation. So let's start on with the key trends and what we expect for 2021 and how we think the new normal will look like when talking about aircraft values. How it will look for passengers, I'll let the comics on the side demonstrate. So firstly, where did we get our data? So the results and trends that I will present to you on the following slides have been compiled by analyzing many different data sources. So the data has been obtained mainly from AVAC and our internal data that we have compiled over years, sort of transaction data from transactions we're seeing. But we've also looked at data published by other appraisers and published by Ishka and Oreo to ensure that we have a full picture. What is also important to remember is that we have analyzed naked aircraft values. So in other words, aircraft that do not have a lease attached. So what are the implications that we're seeing from the corona crisis and what have we learned other than sanitizing our hands? So drops in aircraft values have been highly correlated to the aircraft model and technology. So we expect that aircraft values will continue to diverge this year and also next year. Where we expect new technology narrow-body aircraft values to recover gradually, we don't actually see the same happening with all technology wide-body aircraft. Some all technology wide-body aircraft might benefit from new airlines starting up, for instance. You might have heard of that in Little Norway. There are already 2 new airline ventures, where one of these airlines are focusing on all technology narrow-body aircraft. So we expect that sort of globally, these new airline ventures, as well as airlines in emerging markets, might sort of increase the demand slightly for all technology narrow-body aircraft. On the freighter side, we expect that cargo will continue to do well in 2021. So let us talk about where sort of what we have drawn our conclusions from and why we think that the key trends will look like this in 2021. So we have analyzed 30 years of aircraft market value data. And we've especially focused in this outlook on what happened during 2029 and 2020. So during the crisis, the majority of aircraft models saw a dramatic value drop. But like any other crisis, we saw that some performed better and some performed worse. So across the whole sample of all different aircraft model, vintages, engine options that we analyzed, we saw an average year-on-year value drop of 31.9%. So this is the worst one-year value drop in the 30 years that we have analyzed, and it's an unprecedented crisis in commercial aviation. But as I mentioned, we do have some winners as well. Then we plot the aircraft that were sort of the winners and the losers, and you can see it in the graph on the right-hand side. You will notice two things. So all the winners are cargo aircraft. Cargo performed very well in 2020 compared to passenger traffic. And this also resulted in freighter aircraft actually maintaining their value quite well. We have found in our analysis that across the 30-year history, an aircraft depreciates by approximately 9% per annum. When I say 9% per annum, it's important to remember that this is in history and it's the average over benign and crisis periods. So as you can see in the graph, several of the freighter aircraft had an annual depreciation in 2020 of less than 9%. So that means that many of them depreciated in line with historical annual depreciation. But sort of the clear conclusion that we can draw from this is that these freighter aircraft were barely affected by the crisis in terms of market value development. On the other hand, in the top right corner of the graph in red, you can see the outliers that's on the other side of the scale. So there are only 3 aircraft models there, which is the A340, the A380, and the Boeing 747. So these aircraft models saw a value drop that was higher than 50%. I'd sort of dare to say that it didn't come to a shock, come as a shock to any of us that these aircraft models would be the ones that were most affected by a crisis. But sort of the heavy 55 to 60% market value drop sort of took me as well by a bit of surprise, because as we all remember, these aircraft had fallen out of favor also before the crisis. So their market values were depressed even before the corona crisis hit. And this 55 to 60% value drop is just in the crisis year. It's not taking into consideration the value drop that we saw before the crisis. I would say sort of because of this, our expectation is that these aircraft models will not return to the skies, at least not all of them consistently. So the A340, had a longer life than many expected a few years back when the oil prices were high. So as the oil prices dropped, many airlines, such as, for instance, Lufthansa, kept them in their fleet, provide economic benefits when the oil prices were sort of low enough. But after flights start resuming again after this crisis and the market recovers, we expect that the A340 will not be a part of this journey, so to say, and we expect the A340s to be parted out. For the Boeing 747, we expect that some of the airlines with leased Boeing 747s will return them to service until at least the end of the lease term. So we expect that there will be some demand for used 747-8s, and maybe for a few of the 747-400s, that they might find a new lessee after the first lease expire. But we expect that the majority of the 400s will in the future be sold for parts or converted to freighter and not be a large part of any airline's passenger fleet. The A380, we've already seen that there hasn't really developed a secondary market. So we also believe that the majority of the A380s will be parted out, and that we won't see many A380 in airlines fleet going forward. Our analysis also revealed that the market value drop can be split into 4 main clusters, as you can see here in the graph on the right-hand side. In the analysis, we found that the age of the aircraft is actually statistically insignificant. On the other hand, we found that the body of the aircraft, as well as if it's old technology or new technology, was statistically significant in determining how much of a value drop the aircraft model experienced during the crisis. And just to make it clear, when we talk about old technology or new technology, by new technology, we mean the newest of the model on the market. So we talk about the A320neo, the 737 MAX, the 350, and the 787. When we talk about old technology, we talk about the older versions of these aircraft. So, for instance, the A320ceo. As we already discussed, we had 2 outliers, which is cluster 1 with cargo aircraft and cluster 4 with the 3 widebody aircraft. What is interesting though is that cluster 2 and cluster 3 also has a clear split. So all new technology aircraft, that being the narrow bodies, as well as the A350 and 787 are in cluster 2. And in cluster 3, we find all the regional aircraft. So all technology narrow bodies and also all the wide bodies, except from the A350 and the 787. As the body of the aircraft can determine the value drop, we'll look a bit closer at the different aircraft bodies. So cargo aircraft had the lowest value decline of the whole sample, with an average drop of 18%. And what is interesting is the high standard deviation in the cargo aircraft sample of 13%. This is a result of the very low depreciation of the cargo aircraft in cluster 1 on the previous slide. But it's important to know that even though cluster 1 only had cargo aircraft in it, there are also cargo aircraft in cluster 2. So not all freighters were unaffected by the crisis. Cluster 3, as you might remember, contained the majority of the wide-body aircraft. So when looking at the wide bodies in the sample, we found that wide-body aircraft dropped on average 43.9% or 44%. So the high standard deviation of 10.4% is driven by the outliers in cluster 4. So the 747, the A340, and the A380. If you remove those outliers from the sample, the average drop across wide-body aircraft was 39%, with a standard deviation of 4%. The 747, A340, and A380 are clearly outliers, but the high value drop of 44% demonstrates that the long-haul sector, mostly operated by wide-body aircraft, has been hit very hard by this crisis. So aircraft such as the A330 and the 777 were also at the high end of the scale when it comes to this value drop. This is also demonstrated by the graph on this page. Oriole has revised their base values, and the result of this you can see in this graph. This is the Oriole's revised base values for 10-year-old aircraft. But as I mentioned earlier, we found that age of the aircraft does not have a significant impact on the value drop in percentage terms. So the base value revisions made by Oriole sees a value decrease of the A330-200 of 36%, and the 777-200ER of 52%, just to mention 2 of them. And this is also in line with the value drops that we found in our analysis, even though we analyze market values. We don't expect the A330 or the 777 to ever recover back to pre-crisis levels. And going forward, it's expected that these aircraft will be sold at highly discounted prices in the market. So this could lead to severe losses for investors if the lessee were to default And those investors are invested into subordinated tranches where these aircraft act as security. So in all previous crisis events, we have analyzed and the narrow bodies have performed the best. So during this crisis, as I mentioned, the cargo aircraft have actually been the winners, but there is a large difference still between how wide-body and narrow bodies have been affected. While the wide bodies, as I mentioned, dropped by 44% on average, narrow-body aircraft have dropped by 28% and has a much lower standard deviation of 3.5%. So we expect new technology, narrow-body aircraft, to be the first to recover their values and potentially also be the only aircraft models that will again reach pre-crisis levels. So now we're getting to my favorite slide and the most interesting results of our analysis, in my opinion. During the Corona crisis, the value dropped by 32% on average. This is compared to 23% during the global financial crisis. And it's not surprising, as the aviation sector has never been hit as hard before by a crisis. So we expected this value drop to be much higher than the global financial crisis. The very interesting part, though, in my opinion, is the difference in the standard deviation between the two crisis events. So when we analyzed the global financial crisis, we found that all aircraft values dropped practically by the same amount in percentage terms. So it was in theory irrespective if the aircraft was a narrow body or a wide body, if it was new technology or old technology. And as mentioned before, the age of the aircraft was also statistically insignificant when we looked at the global financial crisis. During the current crisis, on the other hand, the market has clearly differentiated between different aircraft characteristics. So we would actually argue that this is a positive result of this crisis, because it is important that the value drop contains the future expectations of the model, and that it isn't just sort of a panic reaction from the market to an event that happens. On the other hand, this could sort of lead to a different road to recovery than for past crisis events. So in the past crisis that we've analyzed, the market first panicked, all aircraft values dropped quite equally. But during the recovery phase, that's when we saw that new technology aircraft, then especially narrow bodies, recovered the most. As the aircraft characteristics have already been taken into consideration during the value drop in this crisis, it could be that the recovery would be more straightforward, where we actually see a similar recovery level for the majority of aircraft. On the other hand, if this isn't the case and the recovery follows previous trends, there will be a much larger differentiation between new and old technology, and also narrow and wide body aircraft in the future than what we've seen in history. And what I mean by that is that we've already seen the differentiation now in the value drop. If we continue to see the differentiation in the recovery phase, that would make it a much bigger gap between the different aircraft. So the question is then, where do we go next? I think I can say on behalf of the majority of us that we're starting to miss people. And I'm sure the airlines probably miss them even more than we do. At the end of 2018, we published a research paper where we found that, again, by studying history, that approximately 2 years before a crisis, the market became less discriminatory in valuing aircraft. And what we mean by this is that the market valued, for instance, the A320ceo and the A320neo on very equal terms. In our opinion, this creates inflated aircraft values because purely through technology and development, the A320neo is more efficient and should therefore have a higher present value for airlines than what the older A320ceo model does. And it's been evident during this crisis that new technology does perform better also in downturn scenarios. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we don't know how the market will recover and which aircraft models will see the highest recovery or the fastest recovery, or if we will see sort of an equal recovery across all aircraft models, irrespective of body and vintage, technology, etc. We therefore recommend that investors look closely at the aircraft model they're investing into in their transactions. With new technology narrow-body aircraft, they've consistently been the winners in the past. Even though they were bet by the cargo aircraft in this crisis, they've still performed better than the regional aircraft or the wide-body aircraft. And we therefore recommend that investors keep stress testing the transactions they enter into by placing the highest stresses on all technology wide-body aircraft. And if the recovery will follow historical patterns, as I mentioned, new technology narrow-body aircraft will have the lowest risk. So to sort of conclude, the aircraft that have struggled before this crisis, the A350, A380, 747, but also the 777 and the A330 were the aircraft that were hit the hardest by this crisis. The most popular aircraft, such as the A320neo, the A350, the 787, have been able to withstand the crisis the best from the passenger aircraft side. But no aircraft model had been unaffected by the crisis other than some of the freighter models. And this isn't new to this crisis, but something that's been the result of the majority of past crisis situations as well. And as we highlighted before the crisis and also during the current outlook, it is very important for investors to put a high emphasis on the aircraft model they invest into. With credit-weak airlines, the risk in the transaction is substantially higher if the aircraft model is also an all-technology aircraft, or if there is an aircraft that has fallen out of favor with the market. So I think that was a quick summary of the aviation finance outlook for 2021. So that was it from my side, and so I'll hand it back to you again, Keith.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Helen. That very, very insightful and rapid presentation, and I love the cartoons as well.
They go well with statistics.
Yeah. So please do, those of you who are on the call here, please do ask questions. I see there's a couple of questions already come in, Helen. So if I may, I'll just run straight to the first one, which you kind of touched on a bit, but perhaps you can just summarize. And the question is this: how do you see the aircraft financing market developing? Will it recover and return to pre-crisis levels, or will there be systemic changes to the sector?
So I think that if you look at the long haul market, especially now in the beginning during the recovery, we'll see fewer long than before the crisis happened, which is of course a disadvantage for the wide-body aircraft and wide-body aircraft values. Another sort of expectation that we have going forward, not just for 2021, but also for in the longer term, is that we expect there will be a higher focus on green financing. So ESG, environmentally friendly aircraft. So we expect that fuel-efficient aircraft with low CO2 emission will sort of be the most popular aircraft, the one sought after by both investors and airlines. We also expect that as a result of this crisis, which is a very positive thing, we expect that there will be new financing solutions in the market. So yeah, besides bank loans, entering the capital market using an ABS, and also EXIM and other export financing options. We expect that, certain new financing solutions that will help the airlines will be sort of produced or introduced to the market now during or after this crisis.
Yep. Good. Thank you very much. There's a question. I'm not sure if you can see the questions on your screen there, Helen. There's a question about adjustments. Do you want to take that, have a look at that question, and perhaps if you have the information to hand, take that one?
Sure. So the question is, did you have any adjustments for maintenance schedules / reserves? And it is a very good question, because it is important to be aware of the fact that an aircraft value is highly dependent on the maintenance status of the aircraft. When we have looked at this whole sample of aircraft, we have only looked at sort of half-life market values of aircraft, because it isn't feasible for us to go in and look at the exact maintenance adjusted values. For our transaction data, the ones that we have internally, we've also adjusted the values based on the maintenance status of the aircraft in question, and adjusted that value to represent a half-life value. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. And then there was another one there which you may see about the A380. Do you want to take a look at that one?
Yeah, so the A380s that are slated to be pulled, dismantled, returned back as freighter flighters. So the way I understand the question is to freighter aircraft in the future. And there's been a lot of questions about that. And I wouldn't claim that I'm an expert on A380s and the conversion to freighters, but we don't necessarily see that as a feasible option for the A380. First of all, because it lacks a lot of the features that the 747 has, and what makes the 747 a very very successful freighter aircraft, but also because of the cost that it would be involved in turning this into a freighter or convert it to a freighter. And because we don't, if a program would be available to turn the A380 into a freighter, I don't necessarily think that is sufficient to create a secondary market for the A380s in general. So it wouldn't apply to then the whole fleet. It would be more sort of a very niche solution.
Okay, yes, thanks. I guess I feel comfortable answering this one directly, which is, I guess, it's a big question. Perhaps you can try and summarize, the answer. But a question is, what should investors be mindful of when investing in aircraft-backed transactions going forward? I guess that's a big question.
Yeah, like you said, very big question, but trying to make it brief as it's Friday afternoon. And as I mentioned in the outlook, that properly stressing the aircraft models or aircraft values, and be aware of what type of aircraft model you're investing in. Is this an aircraft model for the future with new technology, or is it one of the aircraft models that will be phased out of the market going forward? It's of course also very important to consider the lessee, because if you have an unfavorable aircraft but a very strong lessee, then the overall credit risk of the transaction will be a mix of the credit quality of the lessee and the credit quality of the aircraft in question. What we also seen during the current crisis is that full recourse to a lessor has been very helpful in mitigating a lot of the credit risk in these transactions. So it's also something that we potentially expect going forward, that investors would more often require a full recourse from lessors. Also, it's important to be aware that we can all sort of guess when the market will have recovered. But it's also highly dependent on how the economies develop, because of course, critically important for the aviation sector that the airlines can get back flying and be allowed to fill their aircraft with passengers. But the sector is also, of course, reliant on a strong GDP growth, and that companies and private people can afford actually flying. And also considering then people's habits, if business travel is something that will change or decrease now after the crisis because of all the new technology, and have we managed to cope without traveling now during the corona times. So I think it's important for investors to keep all of these elements in mind when they look at the aircraft model in question, and if that aircraft model is suitable for the potential new normal going forward. And then also, as I mentioned, look at the credit quality of the airline that they're investing into.
Yeah, yes, indeed, that all makes sense. We do have quite a specific question, which you may want to look at, about the B737 MAX. Are you comfortable with that one, or yeah?
Sure. So the question is, what is your view on the future value of the 737 MAX? And as a disclaimer, I am not an aircraft appraiser nor an aircraft engineer. But what we see in the market and what we expect is that as soon as the aircraft gets all the permissions to be back in the air again in all the different regions in the world, we expect that the value of the 737 will behave very or the 737 MAX will behave very similar to the A320neo, because their new technology, the news of their models, and the A320 and 737 have always been the most liquid and popular aircraft in the market, both for airlines and investors as well as for lessors. So when all sort of the safety issues and all the regulatory issues are dealt with the 737 MAX, we expect that to be a liquid new technology narrow body aircraft and behave in that type of manner when you look at the values.
Very good, thanks for that. And apologies for my phone ringing there. Forgot to switch it off. So Helen, there are no more questions coming in. So unless you wanted to recap anything, I suggest we let these very good people get back to their sunny Friday afternoons. And so are you good to conclude there?
I'm good to conclude. Thanks, Keith.
Very good. In that case, let's do that. Thank you so much to all of you for dialing in on a Friday. I hope you found that insightful. I certainly learned an awful lot from that presentation. And so do stay tuned for any kind of future broadcasts around this and other subjects. So with that, we'll wish you a good afternoon. Thank you for dialing in, and stay safe, and see you next time. Okay, bye for now.